The next topic of analysis is so low, so damaging, so ludicrous and extremely embarrassing. One of the multiple so-called gods in Islam is a smooth-looking, beautiful, coiled-haired, kinky-haired, beardless, curly-haired, almost naked, satanic slick young man in his 30s in a beautiful green garden that Muslims blindly worship in absolute unification with the other demonic so-called deities. This is another extremely disturbing and full of filth Islamic book called Al-Jami' li'ulum Ahmad bin Hanbal, the comprehensive collection of the science and teachings of Ahmad ibn Hanbal, specifically the Al-Aqidah, meaning creed section, book volume number 3. As shown on the title and publication pages, the book is published by Dar al-Fallah, a Saudi Arabian Islamic publishing house known for religious and theological works. The book cover and title present the extremely alarming book as a formal religious encyclopedia titled Al-Jami' lil Ulum wal Hikam, the comprehensive collection of sciences and wisdom. Ahmad ibn Hanbal from 164 to 241 AH, meaning 780 to 855 CE, was and still is one of the most influential scholars in Islamic history and the founder of the Hanbal school of Islamic law. He is best known for compiling Al-Musnad, one of the largest collections of hadith in the Islamic tradition, containing tens of thousands of authentic narrations attributed to the low-life Muhammad. This page is the publication and copyright information page from Al-Jami' li Ulum Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, section on Creed Qism al-Aqidah, volume number 3. It states by Dar al-Fallah, publishing and distribution in Saudi Arabia, and the first edition date 1430 AH, which is 2009 AD, on page 391 of Al-Jami' li Ulum Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Qism al-Aqdah, volume 3. The highly esteemed author cites an authentic narration transmitted from Ikrimah, from Abdullah ibn Abbas, the famous companion of the low-life Muhammad and cousin of the hypersexual and lustful so-called prophet, in the extremely alarming Islamic sacred book Sahih al-Bukhari, volume 1, book 5 and hadith number 268. Ibn Abbas narrates that the Messenger of Allah said, I saw my Lord in the form of a beardless young man with abundant curly hair in a green garden. The page then continues with a detailed discussion of the Silsilat al-Isnad, chain of transmission of the hadith, mentioning narrators and transmission routes recorded by Islamic hadith scholars. It also cites scholarly evaluations regarding the route of transmission of the narration, including statements that the chain is shamefully, I will prove why I say shamefully later, is sahha, meaning authentic, and it also meets perfectly the criteria of Imam Muslim, ala shurut Muslim. This page from Al-Jami' li'ulum Al-Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Qism al-Aqdah, volume number 3, page number 391, presents the narration transmitted from Ibn Abbas radiyallahu anh, in which the so-called Messenger of Allah said, I saw my Lord in the form of a beardless young man with abundant curly hair in a green garden. The low-life Muhammad said that he saw his so-called Lord in the shape of a glossy beardless youth. His so-called Lord's hair was long and curly, and the next so-called God was patiently waiting for the low-life Muhammad in a green garden like a good boy that he is. The cyan highlighted section shows the actual narration and chain of transmission. Isnad. While the orange highlighted phrase Mutarab fi Isnadi records a scholarly criticism regarding one specific route of transmission. In hadith terminology, this means that a particular chain was considered disturbed or inconsistent due to variations among narrators. The page therefore documents both, supporting chains and narrations, cited by scholars and scholarly criticism and debate concerning certain isnad routes. This is normal in advanced hadith discussions. Scholars often authenticate one chain, weaken another chain, or argue about which version is strongest. In hadith science, this does not automatically mean the hadith is false or weak, and so Islam and Muslims can't escape this embarrassing and funny so-called God that is one of many. This is another full of satanic filth and extremely disturbing book. It is called Book of Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah, Clarification of the Deception of the Jahmiyyah by Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, 1263 to 1328 CE. He was a theologian, jurist, and author. He is known for his extensive writings on Islamic demonic creed, Quranic interpretation, hadith, and filthy Islamic theology. It identifies the work as volume number 9 and highlights major theological topics discussed in the volume, including satanic Islamic faith, so-called prophethood, the deceptive and tiny Quran, so-called divine attributes, so-called divine vision, Islamic satanic decree, and demonic intercession. This page is the official publication and cataloging information page for Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah في تأسيس بدعهم الكلامية by Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah. It identifies the work as volume number 9, Al-Juz' al-Tasi', and states that it was published in 1426 AAH in Al-Madinah al-Munawwara, Medina, Saudi Arabia, under the supervision of Maktabat Ihya al-Turath and the King Fahd Complex for the printing of the deceptive and tiny Quran. This page is from Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah, Ibn Taymiyyah, volume number 9, page number 197, published in Medina, Saudi Arabia, 1426 AH. The page records multiple chains of narration concerning the report from Ibn Abbas that the so-called prophet said, I saw my Lord. أنه رأى ربه عز وجل شاب أمر جعدا قطا في حلة خضراء. That Muhammad, the low-life, saw his so-called Lord, so-called mighty, and so-called majestic, as a beardless young man with curly hair, wearing a green covering that isn't sewn, like a big green blanket, to cover the nakedness, and that's the reason I say almost naked. The lower highlighted references point to Islamic scholarly source citations and authentication discussions connected to the narration. One highlighted note references Sahih ibn Abi Asim, while another references Talkhis al-Irshad, showing where scholars discussed, transmitted, or evaluated the authentic report and its chains. The page is important because it does not merely quote the authentic narration, but also documents the isnad, meaning chain of transmission, parallel narrations, source references, and scholarly commentary regarding authenticity and transmission history. In other words, the page functions as both a narration record and a scholarly hadith analysis page within Islamic theological literature. This is from Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah by Ibn Taymiyyah, volume number 9, published in Medina, Saudi Arabia, 1426 AH. The page discusses devilish Islamic theological arguments concerning so-called divine vision, Ruya al-Ilahiyya, and the interpretation of Quranic unholy verses related to seeing one of the so-called gods of Islam, which is the young man in this case. The page also references narrations connected to Ikrimah and Ibn Abbas, while discussing classical Islamic repellent theological interpretations regarding the so-called Allah's disturbing attributes and so-called divine vision. The page is written in a classical scholarly style, with footnotes, references, and chains of narration reflecting detailed Islamic theological and hadith analysis. This another segment on page 289 from Bayan Talbis al-Jahmiyyah discusses reports concerning the low-life Muhammad seeing his so-called Lord. The highlighted Chayan section cites the narration from Ibn Abbas in which the so-called prophet says, I saw my Lord in the form of a beardless young man with abundant curly hair in a green garden. The dark red highlighted section records another report stating that Abdullah ibn Umar sent a question to Abdullah ibn Abbas asking, "Did Muhammad see his Lord?" The trusted narrator and cousin of the thief Muhammad, Ibn Abbas replied, "Yes." This is presented by the highly esteemed author as a damaging and laughable evidence for us Christians of yet another so-called God within the satanic ideology called Islam. This is the Islamic theological work, أبطال الطويلات لأخبار الصفات, refutation of the figurative interpretations of the narrations of the divine attributes. The original work was authored by the Muslim judge and theologian Abu Ya'la Muhammad ibn al-Husayn ibn al-Farra, died in 458 AH, a major classical and highly esteemed Muslim scholar known for his writings on Islamic demonic creed and so-called theology. The book spine also identifies it as volume number 1, Al-Juz al-Awwal. The work itself is a classical theological text discussing narrations related to the so-called divine attributes, sifa, particularly in response to interpretive approaches associated with Kalam theology. The edition shown is associated with a publication from Kuwait. On page number 143 of volume number 1 of Abtal Tawilat Akhbar al-Sifat, the highly esteemed author discusses the famous and authentic narration concerning the low-life Muhammad, seeing his so-called Lord in the shape of a youthful man, with abundant curly and coiled hair in a green garden. The page cites distinguished narrators and classical transmitters connected to the same well-respected Ibn Abbas, while also referencing Islamic scholarly discussions surrounding the authenticity and transmission of the report. The highlighted section records a strong statement attributed to Al-Tabarani. Al-Tabarani was and still is a highly respected classical Muslim hadith scholar. Died in 971 CE, best known for compiling major hadith collections such as Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, and he is widely regarded in traditional Islamic scholarship as an important authority in hadith transmission and narration. Regarding the authentic narration, he states that Hadith Qatada an Ikrimah an Ibn Abbas, the hadith of Qatada from Ikrimah from Ibn Abbas concerning the so-called prophet's vision of one of the many so-called gods. In this case, the smooth-looking boy is authentic and literal belief is obligatory, and then declares, "Whoever claims that I retracted this authentic hadith has lied." This statement is presented on the page itself as a direct defense of the authentic narration's authenticity and preservation due to the fact that the low-life Muhammad himself went around telling people that he saw one of the multiple false deities in Islam, meaning the pretty youth in this case. A number of bloodthirsty companions of the low-life Muhammad also narrated this laughable so-called God in Islam. The text therefore emphasizes that certain major classical scholars did not merely mention the narration casually, but openly defended it against claims that they later abandoned or rejected it. This page strongly highlights the side of the discussion affirming the authentic narration and rejecting claims of retraction. Therefore, no Muslim can escape or deny this damaging fact within this so-called monotheistic religion, and embarrassing yet another so-called God that is almost naked and slick within the satanic ideology of Islam. The next page continues the Islamic scholarly discussion surrounding the authentic narration about the low-life Muhammad seeing his so-called Lord, while focusing especially on the reliability and reputation of the narrators connected to the hadith. The highlighted science sections emphasized names of respected classical Muslim scholars and transmitters, including figures such as the Tabrani and many others, as well as the fact that several of the bloodthirsty companions narrated this disturbing, satanic and embarrassing yet authentic hadith. This page further comes with statements of praise regarding their trustworthiness, precision, and status in hadith scholarship. The page also includes evaluations like thika thika, highly trustworthy, showing how major hadith authorities regarded these narrators. What is someone who doesn't accept this, yet another so-called God referred to? That person is considered to be outside the bounds of Islam. So, this is in the criteria of a Muslim in Islam. The red part is the proof for the fact that you are considered a heretic. The moment you reject the beautiful young man, beardless and slick as your so-called God in Islam. The red highlighted sentence in the page reads, الحافظ 16 يقول من لم يؤمن بحديث عكرمة فهو زنديق. Engels C. Translation. Al-Hafiz said, whoever does not believe in the authentic al-hadith of Ikrimah is a Zindiq. Zindiq means a heretic. Abu Bakr, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Sadaqah al-Baghdad was a respected Muslim hadith scholar, jurist, and hadith master. He was a hafz from Baghdad. He studied under leading Islamic scholars, including students and transmitters connected to the school of Ahmad bin Hanbal, and also narrated from scholars such as Ismail bin Mas'ud al-Jahdari. Major hadith authorities praised him for his knowledge, precision, and reliability, with a directly describing him as thika, trustworthy, highly trustworthy. He was known for his expertise in hadith transmission and was regarded as a highly knowledgeable and respected Muslim scholar among the hadith specialists of his time. So, once again, you are considered a heretic the moment you reject this embarrassing and ludicrous yet authentic hadith/narration about this yet another so-called God in the full of filth Islam. This is the Islamic book, نقد الإمام أبي سعيد عثمان بن سعيد على المريسي الجهمي العنيد فيما أفطر على الله عز وجل من التوحيد, literally translated as, and I quote, the refutation of Imam Abu Sa'ad Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Darim against al-Maris, the stubborn, Jahmi, regarding what he falsely attributed to Allah, the Almighty, concerning Tawheed. It is volume number 1, Al-Majlad al-Awwal. Author is Abu Sa'id al-Darmi. Editor is Rashid Hassan al-Lam'i. Volume is book volume number 1, Al-Mujallad al-Awwal. Publisher is Maktabat al-Rushd, Al-Riyadh, المملكة العربية السعودية. First edition in 1418 AH, which means 1998 CE. This is a classical Islamic theological work by Imam Abu Sa'ad al-Darima, written as a detailed refutation of the Jahmi scholar Bishr al-Mars and his theological views. The book focuses on issues of Tawhid, Islamic so-called monotheism, which means the worshipping and absolute unification of the multiple false and demonic so-called deities, the so-called divine attributes of the so-called Allah, the deceptive and tiny Quran, demonic Islamic faith, and related Islamic demonic creed matters, presenting arguments from the perspective of early Muslim orthodoxy and citing unholy Quranic verses, extremely disturbing hadith, and satanic statements of early Muslim scholars that are well honored and respected to this day. Yam is like a code word for heretic in the unruly so-called religion Islam, by the way. This page is page number 813. This page is discussing a point in the Islamic theological argument and then cites a narration chain, Isnad, involving well-known hadith transmitters. The highly esteemed author is arguing against a particular interpretation and is bringing forward supporting reports and their transmitters. The highly esteemed author reports that Al-Hajjaj bin Muhammad transmitted a narration from Ibn Jurij. Al-Hajjaj ibn Muhammad was a well-known and respected hadith transmitter. Ibn Jurayj, Abdul Malik ibn Abdul Aziz bin Jurayj, was one of the famous early scholars and hadith transmitters of Mecca in the 2nd Islamic century. The footnote identifies Ibn Jurayj and gives a brief biographical note. It describes him as a trustworthy narrator. It says thika, which means trusted. A jurist, he was a respected faqih, one of the early scholars of Mecca, and provides references to classical biographical works that discuss him. This is page number 814 of the book Naqd al-Imam al-Darmi al-Marisi, book, volume number 1. The page discusses reports attributed to the cousin of the demon-possessed Muhammad called Ibn Abbas concerning the low-life, so-called prophet seeing his so-called Lord. The page cites an authentic narration from Al-Dahak from Ibn Abbas stating, رأى محمد ربه مرتين في صورة شاب بلا لحية. Muhammad saw his Lord twice in the form of a beardless young man. The page then presents another trusted chain of transmission through Hamad ibn Salama to Qatada to Ikrimah to Ibn Abbas, who reports, the Prophet saw his Lord as a beardless young man wearing a green cloth. After citing these laughable authentic reports, the highly esteemed author addresses an objection from ashamed opponents who argued that the description actually refers to the so-called Al-Malak Jibril, the so-called angel Gabriel, rather than the one of the many so-called gods in Islam. The author rejects this interpretation and argues that the narration is being presented as a report of seeing the so-called Lord, not merely a vision of the so-called angel Gabriel, but of the so-called Allah. Ibn Abbas is cited as saying that the low-life Muhammad saw his so-called Lord twice in the form of a young beardless man. A second narration describes the so-called Lord as appearing in two green, large, unsewn clothes, like two big blankets covering his nakedness. The highly esteemed author explicitly discusses and rejects the interpretation that these reports refer to the so-called angel Gabriel. Reference is Naqd al-Imam al-Darim al-Marus, volume number 1, page number 814. This page is from Naqd al-Imam Abi Sa'd al-Maris, volume number 1, page number 725. It discusses authentic reports about the Thanatophile Muhammad, allegedly seeing his so-called Allah in page number 223 of Sahih al-Bukhari, volume number 2, segment number 7, chapter number 6, the book of Jihad, Kitab al-Jihad. The name of the chapter 6 is called Wishfulness and or Love for Death. The scum Muhammad is a thanatophile. So, my Father is invisible. Jesus Christ is the flesh of the true Lord. But in Islam, one of the many gods isn't even invisible and powerful. He is a young, slick boy, almost naked, long-haired, beardless, curly-haired young man in a green garden. وقد روي عن شادهان عن حماد بن سلمة عن قتادة عن عكرمة عن ابن عباس عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال دخلت على ربي في الجنة في صورة شاب يرتدي ثوبين أخضرين. It was narrated from Shadan, from Hamad ibn Salama, from Qatada, from Ikrimah, from Ibn Abbas, from the Prophet who said, I entered upon my Lord in paradise in the form of a young man in two green clothes. This page presents and discusses an authentic narration attributed to Ibn Abbas about the so-called prophet seeing his so-called Lord in a youthful male shape and wearing two green clothes, unsewn ones like a big green blanket, almost naked, only covering his nakedness with like two big green in color blankets. In the lower portion of this page, some classical Asham Hadith critics are cited discussing not the authenticity of the narration, but rather evaluating its chains of transmission. Rather than simply reproducing the report, the commentary records scholarly objections due to the shameful yet another so-called God in Islam and includes a statement of the ashamed hadith critic Ibn al-Jawzi that this hadith is not established, illustrating that the narration became the subject of some criticism within the ashamed hadith critics. The extensive attention devoted to criticizing this authentic report suggests that some scholars consider this yet another so-called God particularly controversial and theologically difficult. Furthermore, the following page number 726, states that this authentic narration should not be publicly circulated or widely taught. That is consistent with the interpretation that certain scholars were uncomfortable and ashamed with the authentic report. This supports the view that the authentic narration generated some controversy to warrant restricting its wider dissemination, as the dangerous Muslims frequently do with other verses and ahadith in their extremely disturbing books. The highlighted Arabic text reads, وليس هذا من الأحاديث التي يجب على العلماء نشره وإذاعته. And this is not among the ahadith that scholars are obligated to publicize, spread, and or broadcast among the people. On page 726, the esteemed author states that this narration is not among the reports that scholars are obligated to publicly spread and teach. This page illustrates why many foolish Muslims remain unaware of these deeply troubling verses and ahadith found within their own religious literature. One reason is that most people simply do not have access to these classical Islamic books, manuscripts, and historical documents. Even when such sources are available, many are unable to engage with them directly because they are written in advanced classical Arabic language. As a result, the contents often remain inaccessible/incomprehensible to the average reader, who may lack the linguistic background necessary to understand and evaluate the material for themselves. This is not one hadith whose publication and dissemination by Islamic scholars is required to be hidden. There is much more filth within the extremely disturbing books that must be kept hidden from publication and dissemination to the foolish poor Muslims. This is why I said shameful hadith earlier. Imagine believing in something and proudly accepting it, but hiding the core beliefs and foundations from people due to it being embarrassing and peculiar, and therefore instead deceiving and manipulating people. That's what Islam is. Another concerning reality with regard to transparency and honesty in the satanic ideology of Islam. Book title is Kitab al-Ruya, the Book of the Beatific Vision, or the Book of Seeing Allah. Author is Imam al-Hafiz Abi al-Hasan Ali ibn Umar al-Daraqtani, by the Imam, the Hadith Master, Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Umar al-Daraqutna, from 306 to 385 AH. This is the esteemed Muslim Hadith scholar. This classic Islamic theological work is dedicated to the subject of Ruyatullah, the dumb Muslim seeing the so-called God, particularly the question of the low-life Muhammad seeing his so-called Lord, and the dumb Muslims seeing the so-called God in the so-called hereafter from the Islamic perspective. The book gathers ahadith, reports from the bloodthirsty, illiterate, and dangerous companions of the pedophile Muhammad himself, early Islamic scholars, and theological arguments defending the traditional Islamic position on so-called divine vision while responding to ashamed groups that denied the authentic hadith. Publisher is Maktabat al-Manar, place of publication, الزرقاء الأردن, Zarqa, Jordan, edition, الطبعة الأولى, first edition. Publication year is 1411 AH/1990 CE. Kitab al-Ruya is a classical Muslim hadith and theological work by Imam al-Daraqutna, 306 to 385 AH. This first edition was published by Maktabat al-Manar in Zarqa, the city where the evil Abu Musab al-Zarqawi comes from, in Jordan, published in 1411 AH/1990 CE. The book collects authentic narrations and Islamic scholarly discussions concerning the so-called vision of this, yet another so-called God in Islam, and related issues of Islamic demonic creed. Page 358 of Kitab al-Ruya records an authentic narration attributed to Tufayl, the wife of Ubay ibn Ka'b and Sahabiya, meaning girlfriend of the so-called Prophet. In the report, she states that she closely heard the so-called Prophet mention seeing his so-called Lord in his dream in the form of a youthful man with abundant hair, wearing a green cloth, his feet were on green grass, and the so-called God was wearing 2 shoes or sandals. Narla means like the shoes the Arabs used to wear, like sandals, and the sandals were both made of gold. Ahead of the kinky and slick so-called God was a carpet or rug made of gold too. Gold is a metal. I wonder how comfortable those nylon sandals are for this. Yet another demon blindly worshipped by the stupid Muslims. Abu Zar'at al-Razi, from 200 to 264 AH, meaning 815 to 878 CE. Abu Zar'at al-Razi was one of the most respected and influential Muslim hadith scholars of the classical era, widely regarded by later Islamic scholars as a leading authority in hadith transmission, narrator criticism, and authentication, whose judgments were highly trusted throughout the Islamic world. He says, all of these narrators are extremely trustworthy, and they are all known for the strong ties to Islam and their loyalty to the scumbag Muhammad. The highly esteemed author then turns to the trusted chain of transmission, citing comments from hadith scholars regarding the narrators involved. Abu Zur'a is quoted discussing the transmitters and identifying them as known, trusted individuals and loyal to the pedophile Muhammad. However, the page does not stop at merely transmitting the report. It also preserves scholarly criticism. The page later shows that a number of ashamed hadith critics disputed the chain of transmission of this report, not the authenticity, focusing their criticism on the chain of transmission rather than the denial of the authentic narration, because the hadith critics fully know that it's an embarrassingly authentic hadith. In the lower section, the reliability of the route of transmission is questioned, not the authenticity, and hadith number 286 is explicitly described as munkar, objectionable/rejected, indicating that some embarrassed hadith critics did not accept this route of transmission as reliable. The ashamed hadith critics criticized the route of transmission and not the authentic hadith, because the authentic hadith is embarrassingly authentic, and because they wanted the embarrassingly and damagingly authentic hadith hidden. Thus, the page serves both as a record of the authentic narration and as a record of the Islamic scholarly debate, surrounding not its authenticity, but the route of transmission of the specific route of transmission of this damaging, embarrassing, and rather satanic authentic verse within Islam. Page 359 presents a narration attributed to al-Tufail, wife of Ubay ibn Ka'b, in which the so-called prophet is reported to have seen his so-called Lord as a beautiful young man with abundant hair, dressed in green cloth, and associated with sandals made of gold. What makes this page noteworthy is that, unlike page 358, the highlighted wording here does not explicitly state that the vision occurred in a dream. No, this authentic hadith doesn't mention that it was a dream. But earlier page number 358 does talk about a dream. We once again have a contradiction in Islam. So, which is it? Was it a dream or in real life? Anyway, it is wahi. Wahi means revelation, so it still does not matter. This is clearly yet another contradiction in Islam. One time it mentions a dream, and then the next page it doesn't mention that it was a dream, which is wahi anyway. So no dumb Muslim can run from this, yet another authentic narration. Wahi means revelation. Sounds like yet another contradiction in Islam to me, since they like to bring so-called contradictions in the perfect holy book of the true God. Page 359 had number 287 within this edition of the extremely disturbing Islamic book, Kitab al-Ruya by al-Daraqutni. It continues the discussion of authentic narrations concerning the so-called prophet seeing his so-called Lord. The page presents a chain of transmission running through several extremely trustworthy narrators until it reaches al-Tufail, the wife of Ubay ibn Ka'b. In the report, she states that she heard the so-called prophet mention seeing his so-called Lord in the most beautiful shape of a youthful man with abundant hair, dressed in green unsewn cloth, like a big blanket, wearing sandals or shoes in Arabic it is, nylon, made of gold. I wonder how comfortable they are, given that gold is metal, and with a golden carpet or rug in front of his beardless, smooth-looking slick face. This is another extremely disturbing and full of filth Islamic book in my bedroom. The book cover identifies the book as Tafsir ibn Sa'id al-Darmi, an Islamic theological work concerning at-Tawheed. At-Tawheed means absolute unification in worshipping the multiple so-called gods in Islam. But the Muslims will lie to you and say that at-Tawheed means monotheism and the defense of the Islamic demonic creed. It attributes the work to Imam Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Darimi, died in 580 AH, credits Mansur ibn Abdul Aziz al-Shamri as the modern editor and hadith verifier, and places the extremely alarming book within the Usul al-Salaf, principles of the Salaf. The term as-Salaf means ancestors or predecessors and refers specifically to the first three generations of Islam, often honored as as-Salaf al-Salih, the pious predecessors. It also attributes series and a collection devoted to classical Islamic demonic and filthy theological literature. This page is the publication and distribution information page of Tafsir ibn Sa'ad al-Darimu. It states that this is the first edition, 1419 AH/1999 CE, published through the Usul al-Salaf library in Al-Qasim, Saudi Arabia, and lists contact information and authorized distributors in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Lebanon. The book spine identifies the work as Tafsir ibn Sa'd al-Darim and notes its connection to the Maktabat Usul al-Salaf series. The book is edited by the Muslim researcher and editor Mansur bin Abdul Aziz al-Shamri. This page is part of a chapter titled Bab fi Surat al-Rahman, chapter concerning the form/shape of the Ar-Rahim, most merciful. The page records an authentic narration transmitted through Hamad ibn Salama to Qatada, to Ikrimah to Ibn Abbas, and then provides extensive references showing where versions of the authentic report were transmitted and discussed by later Islamic scholars, and extremely disturbing hadith collections. This page records a narration attributed to Ibn Abbas, in which the low-life Muhammad says, دخلت على ربي في الجنة فرأيت شابا وسيما يرتدي ثوبين أخضرين غير مخيطين. I entered upon my Lord in paradise and saw a handsome young man wearing two green unsewn cloth. The remainder of the page is devoted largely to documenting the chains of transmission and references, where the report was transmitted and discussed by later Islamic scholars. Page 442 is not primarily introducing a new narration. Rather, it is part of a defense of the authentic narration and a response to objections raised against the authentic hadith about this pretty boy. The page explicitly reaffirms the authenticity of this narration and presents it as a report accepted by a substantial body of recognized and esteemed Islamic scholars, named in the page one by one. Page 442 functions as a defense of the al-Tufail narration. Rather than focusing on the narrative details alone, the page emphasizes that numerous respected hadith scholars and theologians accepted, transmitted, authenticated, and discussed the authentic report. The highly esteemed author uses this appeal to Islamic scholarly authority to argue that the authentic narration should not be rejected outright, and then restates the report's description of seeing the so-called Lord in a dream in the shape of a youthful, velvety, beardless, beautiful, long-haired demonic figure clothed in green unsewn cloth. The page is doing several things at once. 1. Discussing earlier criticism. At the top, the highly esteemed author quotes statements from early Islamic scholars regarding the chain and the report. Some objections are mentioned due to shamefulness of the pretty lad, and then the highly esteemed author answers and refutes them. 2. Appeal to major authorities. The highlighted section is especially important because the highly esteemed author's argument is, if the hadith were truly unacceptable, why did so many major Islamic scholars preserve it, transmit it, discuss it, or authenticate it? This is why the page cites numerous respected figures from the hadith and Islamic theological tradition. 3. Restatement of the narration. After listing Islamic scholars, the page again summarizes the famous authentic report attributed to al-Tufayl, including the wording that the low-life so-called prophet saw his so-called Lord in a dream in the form of a youthful figure with abundant hair, clothed in green, with gold mentioned in the description. 4. The author's main point. The overall thrust of the page is the narration should not be dismissed merely because some people find its wording difficult or controversial, or are rather ashamed of the yet another so-called God is Islam. The highly esteemed author is arguing that there is a substantial scholarly tradition that treated the report seriously. 5. Why page 442 matters. Compared to pages 358 to 359, pages 358 to 359 of Kitab al-Ruya, Hadith critics criticize the route of transmission and not the authentic ahadith, because the authentic hadith is embarrassing, and because they wanted the authentic hadith hidden and forgotten. Page 442 is largely about Islamic scholarly reception of the authentic report, who accepted it, who transmitted it, and why the highly esteemed author believes it deserves consideration. Page 442 is the answer to pages 358 to 359 of Kitab al-Ruya as a defense of the great companion, Sahabiya, al-Tufail's authentic narration about the yet another so-called God in Islam, the ludicrous attractive boy. The cover is for Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, the great dictionary, by Sulaiman ibn Ahmad al-Tabarani. What the cover says: title is Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, the great dictionary. Author is Al-Imam Abu al-Qasim, Sulaiman bin Ahmad al-Tabarani, Imam Abu al-Qasim Sulaiman ibn Ahmad al-Tabaran, who died in 360. IH. Editor is Shu'aib al-Arnaut, with additional scholarly review in this edition. Volume Al-Juz al-Thani Ashar, book volume number 12. Hadith range is 12,751 to 13,450. Publisher is Dar al-Kutub al-Ilmiya, Islamic Scientific Book House, Beirut, Lebanon. The Great Dictionary. Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir is one of the largest and most famous hadith collections compiled by Imam al-Tabaran. Imam al-Tabaran, from 260 to 360 AH, meaning 873 to 971 CE, was a renowned Islamic hadith scholar, best known for compiling the three famous hadith collections, Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, Al-Mu'jam al-Awsat, Al-Mu'jam al-Saghir. The extremely disturbing book contains thousands of authentic narrations arranged primarily according to the hoodlum, Muhammad's violent and unruly companions, preserving reports with their trusted chains of transmission. Isnad. Because it includes authentic, acceptable, weak, and disputed narrations, scholars evaluate each hadith individually, rather than treating the entire collection as uniformly authentic. Book volume number 12 of this edition contains approximately a hadith 12,751 through 13,450. The authentic narration of the killer Muhammad, seeing his so-called Lord, the beardless young man. Among the narrations found in the classical hadith literature are reports describing the so-called Prophet Muhammad seeing his so-called Lord, the beardless young man. These authentic narrations have been discussed extensively throughout Islamic history and continue to be the subject of theological discussion. One of the major works associated with this narration is Al-Mu'jam al-Kabir, the monumental hadith collection compiled by Imam Abu al-Qasim Sulaiman ibn Ahmad al-Tabaran. This collection preserves thousands of authentic narrations transmitted through numerous chains from the killer Muhammad's illiterate and bloodthirsty companions, and is regarded as one of the largest and most important Islamic hadith compilations. The narration concerning the low-life Muhammad seeing his so-called Lord, the beardless young man, has attracted significant attention because of its theological implications. As a result, it has been the subject of extensive discussion and analysis in the classical Islamic tradition, with scholars examining its literal wording and trusted chains of transmission. In this book titled Al-Mujam al-Kabir, book volume number 12, page number 432, hadith number 13439, we once again know about this yet another so-called God in the satanic ideology called Islam, the smooth-looking, curly-haired, beardless, long-haired, almost naked young man in a garden. This yet another so-called God in this so-called monotheistic so-called religion is found in many more Islamic books. Personally, I have found him in 57 Islamic volumes so far. However, below is the last book in which I will expose and discuss about this almost naked and zesty so-called Lord. The title of this book is Al-Asma wa Sifat, the names and attributes. It is authored by Al-Imam Abu Bakr, Ahmad ibn al-Hussein bin Ali al-Bayhaqi, one of the prominent classical scholars of Islam. The edition shown was edited and verified by Abdullah ibn Amir. It was published by Dar al-Hadith in Cairo, Egypt. The book spine repeats the title Al-Asma wa Sifat, identifies it as book volume number 2, Al-Majald Ithnan, and again lists Dar al-Hadith, Cairo as the publisher. Pages number 363 and number 366 of this book discuss authentic narrations concerning the pathetic Muhammad's authentic reported vision of his so-called Lord. In these passages, the narrations describe the so-called Lord as a beardless, curly-haired, long-haired young man in a green garden. The text presents these reports together with their chains of transmission as part of the author's compilation of narrations dealing with the so-called divine names and satanic attributes of this yet another so-called God. This is the secretly yet another so-called God in the full of filth Islam, beautiful, long-haired, coiled-haired, beardless, curly-haired, almost naked, smooth-looking, wearing sandals made of gold, golden carpets/rugs, in a beautiful green garden young man. I have thus far proven, and therefore count recognizable, so-called God, unrecognizable so-called God, the low-life Muhammad's false deification, and the beautiful, glossy-looking, coiled-haired, kinky-haired, beardless, curly-haired, long-haired, almost naked, patiently sitting and waiting like a good boy for the hoodlum Muhammad in a beautiful green garden wearing sandals made of gold and with a golden carpet or a rug. In short, the zesty boy so-called Lord in Islam, making it 4 false deities. The next topic